to tell you, I am incredibly excited. Now, that sounds like some type of trite statement that anybody will make at any time. It's like somebody about to speak and they say, "Oh, I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad that you're here." Okay, I am not speaking with either hyperbole or just with something that you are supposed to say. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the first special edition of Radar on Leadership where we are diving deeply into something. In many episodes, you'll see Sam and me, and these 3 episodes is just going to be me, even though they introduced Sam. I'll just tell you he's somewhere in Bradenton, Florida. He's probably on the beach right now, but this is all that I'm going to be doing for these next 3 episodes. So I am, let's just say this. I am enthused. I'm not going to use the usually trite expression. I am excited about being here, although I really, really am. You heard the introduction about this 3-part series. Now, I got to tell you, we have a sponsor that is just second to none. When Text in Church and Church Answers began to talk about the possibility of the first special series, and Text in Church said, "Hey, we want to partner with you on this," well, I jumped. I don't know how high I jumped at my age, but I jumped. And I jumped quickly, and I was ready to go. I'm going to read some information to you, and the reason I'm reading it to you is I want it to be precise, and I want you to know about this great conference that is coming up. But the relationship we have with Texan Church and the fact that they jumped to the front of the line to do the first special series podcast, I really want to talk more about them as we go. But let me just read some of the things that is about to happen. This is really about a conference that they are about to go forward, and it will take place next month. So you need to listen up. Of course, you can look at it in your show notes as well. So we have a special 3-part series. You know that. This is part 1, and it is brought exclusively to you by Text in Church. Every year they put on a conference called the Engage Conference. This year, 2022, it is going to be February 8th to 10. Now, first of all, it's a free online conference for church leaders. Second of all, you'll be led by ministry leaders who will actually help your church reach more people using the right technology the right way. And let me say it, Church Answers, one of the most frequent questions that we get, one of the most frequent comments we get 24/7 at Church Answers, and we answer them usually within an hour, but in very short order, is, what do you think about this technology to reach people? What do you think about this technology to reach people? I'm saying without equivocation, check out Text in Church, because if you want to reach and retain people, it is a technology that I think is second to none in what is available. It's for all church leaders, from pastors to tech directors to children's ministers. The list goes on and on. It's for all of you who are involved in the local church. And kind of excited too, Sam and I, I'm here, Sam's not. Sam and I have joined the speaking lineup to talk about the church fostering movement that is a part of our topic that we have for these next 3 podcasts. Now, having said that, I want to talk about this particular podcast. The series is called How Churches Are Getting People to Return to In-Person Services. I don't think 3 years ago I would have anticipated that I would be doing such a podcast series. I mean, we may be talking about reaching people, getting people to come to the worship services, but that key word, to return, you know from where I'm coming on this. To return means that many of them have left because of COVID, during COVID, whatever the case may be. Some of them have not returned. And then there's some who haven't returned to church in some time, but are seeing this as an opportunity to come forward. We're going to dig out our deepest research. We're going to give you some practical case studies and illustrations about how churches are getting people to return to in-person worship services. And when it is all said and done, we are going to have an abundance of information for you, not merely to give you research, but to help you to understand how you can move forward with your church in getting people to return to in-person services as well. I think that this is one of the critical issues facing the church. Well, someone will say, well, it's not all about attendance. We're not talking necessarily about attendance, although attendance is a measure of the gathered church. We're talking about the gathered church. The writer of Hebrews said, don't forsake the assembling of the saints. He was saying that it is so important for the church to come together. The church in Jerusalem in Acts 2 and following, they met often daily in the temple courts and in the homes. The gathered church is a critical part about what church life is about. And I will make a statement that I do not shy away from, that I make quite often. The local church is God's primary instrument for his mission until he returns. Let me say that again. The local church is God's primary instrument for his mission until Christ returns. How do I know that? Well, after Christ ascends into heaven, and we see that ascension that is taking place in the first 2 chapters of the book of Acts. After that ascension takes place, Peter preaches a sermon, and what happens? The church is formed, the first church of Jerusalem. And essentially, from Acts 2 all the way to the first 3 chapters of the book of Revelation, where it's talking about the 7 churches, we are reading about churches, local churches. We're talking about churches in all kinds of situations, whether they're in deplorable moral condition as some were at the church at Corinth, or whether they are churches that are lauded by the Apostle Paul, like the church at Philippi, and to some extent the church at Ephesus, or churches that are having doctrinal issues like the churches in Galatia. Now, here's my point, ladies and gentlemen. The church is mentioned all throughout the New Testament. Once the Gospels end, the Gospels, of course, centered around the life of Jesus, and then it's about the local church. And it continues to talk about the local church until the book of Revelation, and it even talks about the local church in the first couple of chapters of the book of Revelation, and it talks about the local church until Christ returns. And so if the local church is important, then the gathered local church is most definitely important. Now, what we will do in this first series, this first episode, we're going to provide you some of our research that give you the underpinnings of this decline in in-person attendance. Now, I know that many of you have churches that have good online attendance, though our research is showing that online attendance is falling faster than even the in-person attendance did. But this series is basically going to be about in-person attendance, when people gather physically in person together, and we will be talking about the why, the how, and by the time we get to the third of these podcasts, you will not only understand the why behind it, and not only understand the how behind it, you'll understand the application for your church for it. We could not do this all in one podcast. That is why we're doing a series. But instead of you having to wait for a week or 2 weeks for the next episode to drop, we're providing all of them, along with Text in Church. We're providing all 3 episodes at one time. So you can have a binge on Rainer on Leadership podcast, and you can just go listen to all 3 of these at one time, or you can choose to divide them up and take them in little by little. May I make some recommendations? Certainly, I want you to listen to this on the podcast or view it on YouTube, whatever your means of following along with us. But also, get ready to show this to staff members, elders, key leaders in your church. Get ready to share this with them, because this information is absolutely critical. And by the time we finish, you're going to hear about how a movement called the fostering movement is affecting in-church attendance, in-person attendance. Now, for those of you who know anything about the fostering movement, you probably think I'm adding 1 and 1 and getting 3. That is not the case. We'll make the connection at the end. It's really important. But before we do, right now, what I want to do is I want us to get into the underpinnings of declining worship attendance, in-person attendance in churches today. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look deeply at data and information from research and case studies. And in this one, the part one, we're going to explain why you have to understand the underpinnings of this challenge before you can move forward with regaining in-person attendance. Okay, a lot of introductory, a lot of foundational material. It's important. Once again, thanks to Text in Church, because not only are they providing the sponsorship for this special series, but they're really part of the solution. We love what they're doing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But in this episode, Let's look at the underpinnings of why in-person attendance is waning in many churches. Or to put it another way, why haven't all the people come back? Where are they? And quite frankly, many churches today, what we're hearing is we got a lot of our regular attendees and members who have not returned, but we're seeing people we have not seen before. That's a good thing too. And we'll look at the combination of those issues. I don't think you'll ever be able to get the research and the information in this 3-part series that you can anywhere else. So relax for a moment. And if you have your other staff with you or other leaders in the church, as soon as this is over, get ready to, of course, go to the second episode and then the third episode, but you might want to have a discussion after each episode. This research is just simply that important. Okay, let's look at some of the underpinnings. First thing I want to say is COVID is not the main culprit. COVID is not the main culprit. We often assume, and I get it, we often assume that we are having challenges with in-person attendance because of COVID. Now, there is a bit of truth to that, but I do want to expand on it. COVID is not the main culprit. Here, if you were to go back and to look at a attendance chart of a typical church that is representative of much of the research that we do, here's what you would find. You would find a steady rate of decline. Now, we understand that there are about 10% of churches, roughly 10% of churches that are in another category, steady rate of increase. But for roughly 9 out of 10 churches, you would see a steady rate of decline. And if we were to take those numbers and just continue to extrapolate them forward year by year, in other words, you've got the attendance decline, and then we can see the trend, and when we move it forward, basically what would happen is you would currently be in the year 2025 today in 2022. Now, let me explain that. I know that can be confusing. What is happening is that any trend of declining churches that have fewer in-person people attending up until 2019 continued, but it was accelerated and exacerbated by COVID. So even though you are in early 2022 right now, you are really, from a way that the attendance patterns have been moving, you are in 2025. So the trend has just been accelerated. It's not all about COVID. COVID did not cause it as much as COVID accelerated it and exacerbated it. So hear me clearly. We cannot just say, "Oh, this is a COVID thing." I'm hearing churches say, now that COVID's not over by any stretch of the imagination, but now that we're dealing with COVID differently, now that many places are regathering, at least at the time we're doing this recording, now that many places are regathering, everything's going to return back to normal, just like it was in 2019. Not so fast, my friend. It is not. And it's because we weren't returning back to 2019 without COVID. There was a precipitous decline that was taking place in roughly 90% of churches before COVID. Now that same decline is taking place, but it's faster, and it is certainly exacerbated by its tendencies as well. Let me also say this. We have a global audience. I love the fact that we have increasing listeners and viewers from many different countries in Africa, and then Australia, many of the European countries. Obviously, I am not able to get the numbers precisely for your geographical location, but we hear quite often, as a matter of fact, usually in the course of a week, 3 to 4 of our most frequented listeners and readers come from the continent of Africa, some city or nation in Africa. And we're hearing that some of these issues are very similar in other countries as they are in North America. But I have to say, I understand fully that if you are in another country, that this may not be exactly the same, but the principles are still going to help you. The first thing that I just want you to grab a hold of is COVID is not the main culprit. What is? It's called slow erosion, which is no longer slow erosion. Let me give you an illustration. I love the beach. In fact, I go to the beach as often as I can. Sometimes I do my work from the beach. This new life of being able to go anywhere and work from anywhere is something that I love because it means I get to go to my beach. My favorite beach, Nellie Jo tells me not to say it because she doesn't want more people to come there, but I'm going to do it anyway. My favorite beach is Cape San Blas. Cape San Blas is in the panhandle of Florida, but it's the only panhandle beach that faces the west because it's this little sliver of land, almost an island, technically a peninsula because it's connected by a couple of rocks, but really just an island. And it sticks out in the Gulf of Mexico and it faces the west. It is a fragile piece of land. It has St. Joe Bay on one side, then has the Gulf of Mexico beach on the other side. The Gulf of Mexico, I should say, on the other side. So because it's a sliver of land, you can notice erosion of the beach is taking place, but it's always gradual. It'll eventually get to a point where some of the local authorities will say, well, we need to have a beach renourishment project, and they'll pump in sand from the ocean and make the beach a little bit bigger. But you can see the slow erosion, but if you're there day by day, even month by month, it is imperceptible. Well, that's how it was with many churches. You know, if your church has 200 people in average attendance, and it only declines by one person a month, you don't notice it. One month there's an average of 200. The next month there's an average of 199. But what happens over time? After 1 year, you have 12 fewer people, so you're at 188. And then the next year, you're at 176. And then the next year, you're at 164. And then the next year, 152. That's only one person a month. But if you blink your eyes, 4 or 5 years later, you've had 25% decline. That's slow erosion. That's like the beach that is just barely eroding. But if you looked at the beach one day and then came back 5 years later, you would notice there's erosion. Let me tell you what has happened in churches. The hurricane has hit. The biggest hurricane that ever hit Cape San Blas it hadn't been that long ago. It was Hurricane Michael, Cat 5. Utterly it destroyed Mexico Beach next door to Cape San Blas, but it was massive. It was just absolutely massive. Historically, we don't think the Cape San Blas has ever gotten a Cat 5. Here's what happened. You went back to the beach. Here's one thing I remember when I was able finally to walk on the beach. I waved to a guy who was in his balcony. It was a beachfront house. I waved to him because I used to walk the beach, and he would wave to me, and I'd wave to him this time. Only one difference: there was no beach in front of him. His house was in the water. He was waving from the water. The erosion that had been ever so slight, imperceptible, just washed away the beach. Not to mention all the other damage that was done, the massive damage. COVID is the hurricane. COVID is the Cat 5 hurricane that has hit us. The erosion was going to continue anyway, but the slow erosion turned into rapid decline. Do you get the picture of what is taking place? This was happening anyway, but it has been accelerated and exacerbated by COVID. There also was a perplexing pattern that preceded COVID. And this perplexing pattern was basically most of the people that the attendance increases were attributed to were cultural Christians. What is a cultural Christian? Cultural Christians were those who would come into the church, and when they came into the church, they did so because they wanted to be accepted in their neighborhoods or in their jobs or in their political positions. And that perplexing pattern that we were actually holding our own with non-Christians who were attending. And once that began to go away, one thing happened with COVID. People stopped going to church, and among those people were these cultural Christians, and they stopped going to church. And you know what they found out? They found out it didn't make a difference. People didn't judge them. Not going to church was no longer a bad thing. In fact, many sectors, not being a part of the church was a cool thing, if you will. And so there was this perplexing pattern that preceded COVID that we were holding our own or having slight declines because of cultural Christians. That is not the case anymore. In most sectors, even the mythical Bible Belt of the South and the Southwest, in most locations, cultural Christianity has gone away. Most churches did not see that perplexing pattern, and so they were not prepared for those people, cultural Christians, not to return. Now, there's something else about the perplexing pattern. You got a group of people who are not returning. And so attendance, people, the church starts regathering, and people are looking around and saying, there are not as many people here as there were, particularly in 2019 and before, which is true. And so there's this perception of lack of health. There's this perception that, oh, our church is in bad shape. We're dealing with churches like this on a regular basis at Church Answers. And what happens when a church either perceives it as sick or it is actually sick? Disunity begins to take place. It's called the blame game. And disunity was a corollary of this perplexing pattern. And so people did not return because they didn't have to return. And then the church became disunified. Now it became disunified over other issues, obviously. There were all kind of COVID issues. You remember mask, no mask, social distance, no social distance, vaccination, no vaccination. It goes on and on and on. And though that was happening in the general culture, it was also happening in the churches. And sometimes the churches would, well, let me just say, church members can be some of the meanest people around. And it was happening in many of those churches. So a corollary of people not returning was a disheartening type of posture among the church members, and then disunity. Now, what does disunity do? It is a symptom of church members looking inward. They're looking in on themselves instead of reaching out beyond themselves, instead of serving beyond themselves. And when that happens, the church not only is having disunity within the church, but they are not reaching people outside of the church. So you've got this accelerated problem. People are not returning. Then when people are not returning, there's this disheartening posture. This disheartening posture leads to disunity, and this disunity leads to an inward focus, which turns around and means there's no longer an outward focus. It is one thing on top of another. And that's where we are in many of our churches today. And even though you may be regaining some of your members back and some of your attendees back, that is the challenge that is before us right now. So we're going to state that where we are right now, that the worship attendance is 20% lower than the 2019 worship attendance. That's a median. Understand, a median is not an average. A median means 50% are on one side of the number, means they have greater than a 20% loss, and 50% have fewer than a 20% loss. It's not an average. So it is the median worship attendance is 20% lower in 2019, and that masks the problem. Because what that is telling us is, oh, we've only got 1 out of 5 than we had in the past. 1 out of 5 fewer than we had in the past. That's not really the case. We have replaced people who have not been in church at all from those who have gone. And so we've really lost more like 30% or 40%, but we have replaced them with newer people. Now, I hope that when all this is said and done, you're going to stick with me for the next 2 episodes, because we're going to get into not only here's why the problem took place, but we're going to begin to talk about what we can do about it. We're going to talk about some of the issues that are coming forward. As a matter of fact, when we get to part 2, we're going to talk about how some churches are defying these negative trends. And we'll go from the bad news to the good news. But I wanted you to understand, before we get into more of the COVID situation, or even the bigger picture of why people are not returning to in-person worship attendance, I wanted us to look at the reasons behind it. So you got a picture of that? You got an understanding of what is taking place? Well, get ready, because we're going to be going to the next episode, and it's already available if you're ready to binge on Rainer. I can't imagine anybody wanting to binge on Rainer, but maybe binge on the content. We're so thankful to Texan Church for their sponsorship of this podcast. Don't forget, folks, they're putting on a free conference this February for church leaders just like you. You're going to be able to trade technology for confusion for proven tips and strategies. Highly practical, very useful. Don't miss it. Learn about leading your church, and listen to this. They got over 18,000 church leaders from around the globe attending. You know what FOMO is? FOMO, fear of missing out. Don't miss out on this. This is a conference that you must attend. We'll be there with you. Sam and I, by the way, did I mention to you that it's just me on this podcast? Sam's probably on the beach somewhere. Sam and I will be there with you, sharing a session on the church fostering movement, which is directly connected to the regathering movement that we're talking about in these podcasts. You don't want to miss it. It's 100% free, 100% online, and you don't have to travel anywhere. The link is there for the Engage conference, February 8th to 10th, and you can register online. And you'll see the link is churchanswers.com/engage, churchanswers.com/engage. Okay, thanks for staying with me with this foundational episode. We're talking about the why. Now we're going to be able to get into some of the fun stuff, some of the churches that are defying the trends, and they're on the other side of that median, even significantly on the other side. They're actually seeing some growth instead of declining. We appreciate so much you listening or watching this episode of the special series of Rainer on Leadership, how churches are getting people to return to in-person worship services. Make certain you listen or watch all 3 episodes with you, people in your church, leaders, whomever, as we go deeply into this important issue. They're available immediately. YouTube, or wherever your favorite podcasting app is. And we're going to continue to look at this, and we're going to help our churches, your churches, get healthier together.